Crime is at record levels throughout the state of California. That's just a fact. Many people say the high crime rate is part of the reason why so many Californians are fleeing in record numbers. Los Angeles and the Bay Area, for example, are witnessing constant smash and grabs, violent crimes, home invasions, car burglaries, the list goes on. Californians I speak with say they're afraid these days, and some who were traditionally gun opponents, well, they're now purchasing guns just to protect themselves. And they're also adding things like bars on their windows, cameras outside their doors, those security iron gates with the metal spikes to the perimeters of their houses for safety, really anything and everything just to keep the criminals out. A lot of California residents I interview also tell me they're worried that criminals have all the rights in this state and victims have none, or so it seems that way to them. They're also concerned there's been a massive metamorphosis, you could say, within the criminal justice system, where the perpetrator of the crime is now the victim due to what they claim are progressive and liberal laws that ultimately protect criminals today, whether these laws were originally well-intended or not. Californians also tell me they're concerned that liberal district attorneys in this state seem to have taken an anything-goes approach to criminal justice, where in the name of social justice or restorative justice, so to speak, criminals are not prosecuted and they're let back on the streets. Now, listen, don't get me wrong. I know this is a complicated issue. Certainly over the decades, there's been a history of what many term injustice and inequality within the criminal justice system. I've reported on this situation over the years, particularly as this relates to people of color, disadvantaged communities, what have you. And to be fair, I know that narrative, it frustrates some of the folks on the right. However, that is also just a fact. And obviously there are many layers here, many dynamics that cannot be ignored, should be studied, and should be discussed further. However, the history of the justice system, good or bad, well, that does not negate the fact that we're currently dealing with insane crime rates these days in California and throughout the U.S. And to be clear, with regards to crime, I'm simply quoting the crime victims and the many people I talk to each and every day when I'm reporting. Now, these same people I interview say that things like a no cash bail policy or defunding the police, slashing police budgets, obviously fewer cops on the street, well, that's also encouraging and consequently protecting criminals. And I've interviewed folks who argue that even if city leaders talk a good game and implement things like, say, for example, a new crime task force or a tough on crime policy, it all sounds good. Many mayors are talking about that these days, where they're promising the public that criminals are going to be tracked down and arrested. Well, many argue the reality is if these same criminals are not prosecuted, that's not a deterrent. So that's what Californians are telling me. Now, I know this sounds harsh to many liberals. I get all that, and I certainly don't make any friends on the left when I report on these stories. However, I'm here to report the news accurately, and facts are facts. As an independent journalist who reports without political bias, and if you follow any of my investigative reporting, you know I both praise and blast the left and the right when warranted. So I can safely say, talking about crime, no matter how much some Democrats or the far left insist that crime is due to COVID, or the pandemic aftermath, or some of the liberals and the progressives, well, they're saying that crime is just a Republican talking point, or that conservatives are simply trying to scare people with political theater and their law and order agenda. No, that is not true. The reality is crime is out of control, and people are now living in fear. So with all that said, I asked 2 California state senators from different political parties about some of the concerns I just mentioned. This is reporter David Nazar, and here's part of my interview with Democrat State Senator Josh Newman and Republican State Senator Scott Wilk. We're going to talk crime, and I've got to be honest with this. It's a disaster here in California. It's a disaster throughout the U.S. No matter what the Democrats say or how progressives blame, I mean, I'm listening to the news, they're blaming COVID still, or the progressives say, well, there's not such bad crime. It's just a political talking point to the Republicans. That incenses me. I'm livid because, listen, I'm not going to cite the LA Times or all these newspapers. I'm going to cite the police blotters at the LAPD. Just check out the police blotters every week in LA or throughout the country. Crime is not a political talking point, senators. Crime is increasing dramatically. We got violent crimes, homicides, home burglaries, whatever the case may be. And it's got to be a priority for both Democrat and Republican. Whoever wants to jump in, go ahead.
I'll let Scott go first.
Well, I mean, I completely agree with you. Everywhere I go, people talk about crime. I remember I was out in Victorville. This had to have been pre-COVID. must have been pre-COVID. I was speaking to this African-American lady who works at Best Buy, and she's there checking out this guy, and the guy goes, "Oh, how much are we up?" All this stereo equipment stuff. How much are we up to? She goes, "Oh, it's about $750." She goes, "Thanks," and he starts running out with the cart. And now a lot of these stores, retailers they don't want their employees to chase after, because one, they're concerned about, obviously their safety, as well as, potential, liability. So, I mean, I think, Prop 4757, well intended. And there's some aspects of both those propositions that should probably stay in place, but we definitely need to do some reforms there. I don't think you're going to see it in the legislative process, however. So that's something that we'd have to do as the people outside the building.
Senator
So
Newman.
let me give it a little context. So Scott mentioned, a guy running away with X amount of goods, right? So California did raise the threshold for the amount of the value that you could steal before it was considered something above a misdemeanor offense. So $950. And it is probably true. In fact, we know it's true that people who do bad things, like everybody else, they're rational actors. And so what you have is systems behaving like systems will. So surprise, right? We have a lot more property crime. We have a lot more theft, especially at kind of the retail level, because people know exactly what the rules are, and they're going to push it right to the end. And so I'll speak for myself, but hopefully for other Democrats, we should be honest about that. We should be honest in California when we make changes to law that cause unintended systemic changes like this. We should be willing to go back and say, hey, maybe our initial sort of impulse was solid, the broader goals are good, but we have to account for these unintended consequences. If you don't do that, you're not serving the people who sent us here.
Well, actually, that effort was tried. It was our Democratic colleague, Assemblyman, had a bill to implement all those reforms. He's now the new sheriff of Sacramento County. And the problem we have, and this is something we need to change, is we need to take the politics out of writing the ballot statements. It's done by the Attorney General, which has a political slant, and it really should be shifted over to the Legislative Analyst's Office, which is nonpartisan. And I think it confused a lot of voters. I think they were in favor of those reforms, and it failed because they're misled by their own government by the way it's structured in the voter pamphlet.
So David, I'm sure you've talked about this at some point. So what Scott's talking about is when you get your ballot, when you get the sample ballot, there's a title and a summary of a proposition. The title can be very misleading, and the summary can be absolutely very confusing. And so at the end of the day, I think it's fair for voters to ask one really simple question: is like, how come we have to decide this stuff instead of the people we elect to do it?
Because we're not doing it.
Listen, that's a good point and another conversation for another day, but all these ballots and initiatives that we're voting on, lobbyists, special interests, fine print, you can't make heads or tails of what these are about. It's misleading. That entire process has to be fixed. This is reporter David Nazar. Let me know your opinion. Your voice is vital.